Hi, everyone. My name's Amee LaTour. I'm a staff writer on the Marquee team here at Ballotpedia. The 2022 general elections are just a little over 6 months away, with primaries beginning in earnest next month. Texas is the only state that already held primaries, and things are going to pick up quickly in May, with 12 states holding their statewide primaries, with the season wrapping up in September. 46 states are holding elections for governor, seats in their state legislature, or both this year. And one of the things we analyze every year is how those elections might affect state government trifectas. Which trifectas are at risk? Which states might see new trifectas form? We just finished our first version of that analysis for 2022, and I wanted to share those findings with you today. And to help me do that is Dave Beaudoin, my fellow staff writer on the Marquee team. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Happy to be here, May.
All right, let's start with a very fundamental question. What is a state government trifecta?
Sure. So a state government trifecta occurs when one party holds the governorship and majorities in both chambers of the state legislature. So currently there are 37 state government trifectas. There are 23 Republican trifectas and 14 Democratic trifectas. And then the remaining 13 states have a divided government where neither party has a trifecta. And then here's a look at how that state data kind of plays out by population in the next slide. So using census estimates from July 2020, about 42% of people currently live in states with a Republican trifecta, 34% live in states with a Democratic trifecta, and 24% live in states with divided government.
Okay, that's interesting. And before we get even further into the numbers, why is looking at state government trifectas important? Why do we pay attention to these numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So changes in a state's trifecta status can often bring about changes in a state's policy priorities because trifecta control affords a political party the opportunity to advance its agenda. And of course, political parties in every state are not homogeneous. So all of this kind of becomes a little more complicated when there is either intra-party factions or personal or policy disagreements between some of the key players. So, for example, you might have legislative leaders or governors, even from the same party, that have different policy priorities. And it's also the case that in some states, the relative power between the governor and the legislature can be different. But in general, when one party has control of both the legislature and the executive branch, they can exert more control over policy. And as a general rule, maintaining divided government or gaining or breaking trifectas can often be a major priority for the party, each party heading into each election cycle.
All right, thank you. So let's get into our breakdown for this year. I said earlier, 46 states are holding elections for governor or one or more of their legislative chambers or both those types of offices. So theoretically, trifecta status is at stake in all 46 of those states. How does that break down?
Yeah, so 36 states are holding gubernatorial elections in 2022, as most states hold those contests in non-presidential but even numbered years. And also there are elections for some or all seats in 88 of the country's 99 state legislative chambers. We know that because that's why we're so busy working on elections this year. And so elections for one or more offices that make up the trifecta are taking place in 22 of the 23 states that currently have Republican trifectas, 13 of the 14 states that currently have Democratic trifectas, and in 11 of the 13 states that have divided government.
Okay, so how does our trifecta vulnerability analysis work? What factors do we consider and how?
Yeah, so Ballotpedia calculates the chances of a trifecta breaking or forming by evaluating each component individually and then assessing the chances of them changing control. So, for example, we base our gubernatorial race evaluations on the race ratings from the Cook Political Report, from Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, and Inside Elections. And then we assess the state legislative chambers according to the absolute number of seats that are up for election and the proportion of seats that would need to flip for partisan control to change. And we evaluate both chambers in the state's legislature individually. So then from there, we rate each trifecta as not vulnerable, somewhat vulnerable, moderately vulnerable, or highly vulnerable.
All right, so that is what Ballotpedia does here. And so what were the results?
Yeah, so our initial analysis showed that 13 of state government trifectas, so 13 out of the 37, are vulnerable in 2022. The Democrats are defending 7 vulnerable trifectas, and Republicans are defending 6. And also, both parties have 1 trifecta that we've rated as highly vulnerable.
Let's look at the highly vulnerable trifectas, starting with the Democratic trifecta in Delaware.
Okay, so in Delaware, we've rated the Democratic trifecta, as you said, as highly vulnerable. The first state is not electing a governor this year, so the only change that could happen would happen in the legislature. So Democrats have a 14-7 majority in the state Senate. So if 4 net seats flip from Democratic to Republican, that would break the trifecta. It would also be broken if there was a net change of 6 seats from Democratic to Republican in the state House, which has 41 members.
All right, thanks. Are there any vulnerable, highly vulnerable Republican trifectas?
Yes, 1. So we rated the Republican trifecta in Arizona as highly vulnerable. The governor's race there is rated as a toss-up by those 3 newsletters that I mentioned before. And Republicans have a 1-seat majority in both the state House and the state Senate. So if Democrats capture the governor's race or flip 1 net seat in either chamber, that will break that trifecta.
Okay, so 1 highly vulnerable trifecta for each party. How about the trifectas that Ballotpedia is classified as moderately vulnerable?
All right, so again, we have the same symmetry, same number on for each party. There are 6 in total. 3 for the Democrats and 3 for Republicans.
All right, let's start with the Democrats.
Okay, sounds good. So we've rated the Democratic trifectas in Colorado, Maine, and Nevada as moderately vulnerable. Now, all 3 states are holding their governor's elections this year. Now, in Colorado, the gubernatorial election is rated as safe Democratic. But control of the legislature will flip if there's a change of 3 net seats in the state Senate or 9 net seats in the state House. Then switching to Maine, their gubernatorial election is rated as leans Democratic, and partisan control of either chamber of the legislature would change if there's a flip of 5 net seats in the Senate or 7% of the seats in the state House. There's 151 seats in the Maine House of Representatives. And then Nevada's gubernatorial election is currently rated as a toss-up. It has a Democratic incumbent. And Democrats have a majority in the state Senate, 11-9, which is obviously very small, but only half of the chamber, or 11 seats, are up for election.
All right, so Colorado, Maine, Nevada. And like on the Democratic side, there are 3 moderately vulnerable Republican trifectas. Those are Georgia, New Hampshire, and Texas.
Exactly. So in Georgia, the gubernatorial election there, which is currently Brian Kemp, is the Republican incumbent there. That election is currently rated as a toss-up. And then partisan control of either chamber of the legislature would change with a flip of 7 net seats in the Senate or 8% of the seats in the state House. So in New Hampshire, that gubernatorial election is rated safe Republican. New Hampshire elects their governors every 2 years. But control of the state Senate would flip with a net change of either 3 seats from Republican to Democrat, and then state House control would change if there's a net change of 4% of the seats in the state House. The interesting thing about New Hampshire is it has the House of Representatives in New Hampshire has 400 members. So 4% of the seats, which is the number it would take to break the trifecta, calculates out to 17 seats. And that may sound like a lot, but in 2018, Democrats went from having 167 seats before the election to 233 after. And then in 2020, Republicans went from 156 seats before the election to 213. So sizable changes in the makeup from the New Hampshire House of Representatives happen not infrequently.
Wow, that's really interesting. All right, and so how about the trifecta in Texas?
Texas, yes. So the gubernatorial election there is rated safe Republican, with Greg Abbott as the incumbent there. But state Senate control would flip with a net change of 3 seats from Republican to Democratic, or a net change of 8% of the seats in the state house.
All right. And finally, there are 5 states we've considered somewhat vulnerable.
Yes, we won't go into super detail on those, but there are 3 Democratic trifectas that we consider somewhat vulnerable. Those are in Illinois, Oregon, and Washington. And there are 2 states, Florida and Iowa, that have Republican trifectas that we consider as somewhat vulnerable.
All right. So we've talked about the vulnerability of existing trifectas. But there are also 13 states with divided government and 11 of those where a new trifecta could form based on this year's results. Have we taken a look at those?
Definitely. So determine the possibility of a particular party forming a trifecta in a state where one does not exist. We consider the likelihood of each party taking control of each individual trifecta component that it currently lacks. So, for example, the Republican Party is and controls the governorship in Maryland, while the Democratic Party has majorities in both houses of the General Assembly. So, as we project the outcome of the gubernatorial election, we're looking at the likelihood of a Democratic trifecta forming. And then when we look at the projections related to the legislative elections, we look at the likelihood of a Republican trifecta forming. So just like with the trifecta vulnerability, we look at each individual component. We review the gubernatorial ratings using those 3 publications that I mentioned earlier. And we also look at the absolute number of seats and the proportion of seats that would need to be flipped.
All right. And what did that analysis show?
Okay, so as we can see on the map coming up on the next slide, we've rated that 9 of the states that are holding elections for 1 or more trifecta components have the possibility of a new trifecta forming.
All right, and I see that in one of those states, Alaska, there's a significant chance of a Republican trifecta forming.
Yeah, so that's why that's colored as a darker shade of color there. Alaska's governor is a Republican, and the gubernatorial election there is rated as likely Republican. And Republicans currently have majorities in both the state Senate and the state House. So you might wonder why that isn't already a Republican trifecta. But partisan control of the Alaska House of Representatives is currently split between the parties under a power sharing agreement that first started in about 2018. And this was due to divisions within the House Republican caucus. So if we go into a little bit further detail on this, it would surely exceed the time that we have. And it's probably the subject of another briefing. But the Alaska House would definitely be a chamber to watch this year, not just the elections, but also what happens as they go to, form the new leadership of the House in 2023.
Right. Yeah, I imagine we could do about 5 briefings on Alaska this year if we wanted to. Well, what about the other states where a trifecta could form?
Okay, according to our methodology, the states that qualify as a possible Democratic trifecta pickup are Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and North Carolina. And those are shaded blue on this slide. So Maryland and Massachusetts currently have Republican governors, but both legislative chambers have Democratic majorities, and both states are electing governors this year. So that's why they're in that category. Minnesota has a Democratic governor where that race is rated as safely Democratic. But it's one of just 2 states where the partisan control of the legislature itself is split. So to achieve partisan control, Democrats would need to flip 3 net seats in the state Senate. And then in North Carolina, they have a Democratic governor that won't be up for election until 2024. And Democrats would need to flip 4 net seats in the state Senate and 8% of the seats up for election in the state House. And then on the Republican side, there's just 1 state where there's a moderate possibility of that party forming a trifecta, and that's in Kansas. Both legislative chambers have Republican majorities, and the state currently has a Democratic governor, Governor Laura Kelly, but that race is right now rated a toss-up.
All right. And are there states where both parties have the possibility of establishing a trifecta?
Yeah, there are, and these are states that are going to be, super closely watched as we head into the next 6 months and into the election. We consider those states as a toss-up potential trifecta, and they're shaded purple on the map. Those three states are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. They always seem to be in the spotlight every year, and all three currently have Democratic governors and contested gubernatorial elections that are rated either toss-up or leans Democratic. And in all three states, Republicans control both chambers of the state legislature.
Well, thank you for breaking down all those different scenarios. Have we looked at what happens if either party performs really well this year? What would those outcomes look like for each party?
Yeah, so we went ahead and did this, and it's a really interesting exercise. So we took a look at the potential best case scenarios for each party based on the pre-election projections and forecasting. And we defined each party's best case scenario as an outcome in which the party gains all of the potential new trifectas that are rated towards them or as a toss-up. And then obviously they retain all of their current trifectas. So also under a party's best case scenario, the opposing party loses all of its somewhat and moderately vulnerable trifecta. So it's really kind of what happens if everything breaks totally favorable for either one party or the other.
All right. So what is the best case scenario for Democrats?
Okay, so we did a map of what that would look like, and that's the slide that we have up on screen. And this would involve the number of Democratic trifectas going from 14 to 22, the number of Republican trifectas going from 23 to 17, and 11 states would have divided government under that scenario.
All right. And how about Republicans? What's their best case scenario?
Okay, so that's a completely different map. And it's reflected on the slide that we had there. And the number of Republican trifectas would go from 23 to 28. There would be 15 states with divided government, which is up from the current number of 13. And the number of Democratic trifectas would go from 14 to 7.
All right. And for some context, what happened with trifectas in the last two election cycles?
Yeah, definitely. So, the 2020 elections resulted in Republicans gaining two trifectas in Montana and New Hampshire. And both of those states had divided government at the time of the election. In Montana, the Republicans were able to win the governor's race, and they had both chambers of control in both chambers of the state legislature. And in New Hampshire, they had the governorship and they flipped both chambers of the state legislature. In 2021, Republicans in Virginia broke what had been a Democratic trifecta. They won the governorship and also control the House of Delegates. So, and then interestingly, from 2010 to 2021, there were 73 state government trifectas that were either broken or gained during this period. And interestingly, during this time, there were 10 states that didn't see any change in their trifecta status, and 16 states that had their trifecta status change once. So what that means is 24 states, almost half of them, had two or more changes in trifecta status over that 10-year period. So this tends to happen, somewhat frequently, even though in each individual cycle, you never know what's going to happen.
All right, thank you. And how about the history of trifectas over a longer period? How far back have we been analyzing this?
Yeah, so we went back and analyzed trifecta status all the way back to 1992, and I know, Amee, this is one of your favorite charts. And as you can see, the red line represents the number of Republican trifectas, blue is the number of Democratic trifectas, and the gray line is the number of divided governments. So as you can see, the number of Republican trifectas at the start of this period in 1992 was 3, and then 31 states had divided governments. The number of Republican trifectas increased by 10 or more, both as a result of the 1994 and the 2010 elections, which is really interesting. And then what also stands out is that steady decline in the number of states with divided government, which, as I said, went from 31 when we started this analysis in 1992 to the current number of 13, which is the lowest number of divided government in 30 years. And then obviously, some states have more frequent changes in their trifecta status than others, but Utah is the only state that has remained the same trifecta from 1992 to 2022, this whole period. And Republicans have had a state government trifecta during that entire time.
Wow, that is all really interesting. Thanks, Dave. So before we finish up, we invited attendees to submit questions ahead of the call today. Let's check out a couple. First, how has redistricting factored into this analysis? Have we considered each party's chances under new district boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer to that is no, because factoring in whether the redrawn district boundaries in any given state would result in the likelihood of more or fewer states changing partisan control would really involve a lot of conjecture and subjectivity. And we didn't attempt to do that here, since in a lot of cases, we just really don't know which party is favored in all these new districts. So our analysis is just based on the raw number of seats that would need to change parties.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you. Here's another question. Will you revisit this analysis before the election? How likely will these ratings change?
Yeah, that is a really good question as well. So we expect to review this analysis 2 or 3 more times ahead of the November elections. Although the raw number of seats up for election won't change, there are 2 aspects of our analysis that could. So one would be if there were ratings change in a gubernatorial race. This could happen based on which candidates win the nomination in the primary, or events that might happen in the states themselves as part of the election campaign. And then the other thing that might change in those states that fill their state legislative vacancies through special elections, there could be a change in the partisan balance of either state Senate or state House if a seat is flipped in a special election. So if a seat is flipped, the number of seats required in order to change partisan control, that number may change based on the outcome of a special election.
All right, well, thanks for answering those, Dave, and for all this information about trifectas today.
Yeah, I was happy to be here. Thanks.
And thanks also to Lauren, our communications associate, for the helpful presentation that was part of today's briefing. I hope you all enjoyed this early look at trifecta vulnerability in this year's elections. If you're new to Ballotpedia, this is the level of analysis we do on lots of different topics each year. And as I said earlier, the election calendar is heating up with almost every state holding its primaries between May and September, and we'll be covering it all. Ballotpedia relies on donations for all we do. So if you'd like to contribute to our work, and if you're able, please consider doing so at ballotpedia.org/donate. You can stay updated on what we're doing by regularly visiting our homepage, ballotpedia.org, where you can find the latest political news and links to our major coverage areas and analyses. Another way to stay informed is through our newsletters, which cover topics ranging from election policy to the federal courts and lots more. There's a link on our homepage to a full list of newsletters. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks a lot for watching.